Between May 3rd and May 11th, 1982, 7 men died along a 90-mile stretch of the lower Mississippi River corridor in what locals would quietly refer to as the River Market Erasure. All adults, all connected to the same smuggling operation. The method was varied: drownings that looked like accidents, vehicle crashes on roads that claimed lives every year anyway, disappearances into currents that had swallowed bodies since before anyone kept records. The perpetrators weren't rival cartels or federal agents. They were 5 members of the Delgado crew, an extended family of transport operators who'd spent 3 generations moving goods through Louisiana's waterways and back roads, eliminating everyone who'd stolen the route that had kept their families alive since 1949. Authorities would later classify it as a series of unrelated incidents, tragic but explainable by the dangerous nature of river work and rural highways. But the people who worked the corridor knew better, knew that when someone took what belonged to the Delgados, when someone thought a route could just be claimed because you found it on a map, there was a price that came due, and that price was always paid in full. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. St. Gabriel, Louisiana, wasn't much more than a scattering of buildings along Highway 75, where it curved south toward the Mississippi River in the spring of 1982. Population maybe 2,800, spread across lowlands that flooded when the river decided to remind everyone who was really in charge. The nearest real city, Baton Rouge, sat 15 miles north on roads that turned to soup when the spring rains came heavy. Most folks in St. Gabriel had never been farther than New Orleans, 60 miles downriver, and even that trip was reserved for weddings or funerals or the kind of business that couldn't be handled locally. May in Louisiana meant temperatures climbing into the low 90s by afternoon, humidity so thick you could see it hanging in the air like wet cotton. The smell was river water and chemical plants, cypress rot and diesel fuel from boats that worked the channel, and underneath it all that particular scent of decay that comes from a landscape that's half land and half water, and never quite decides which it wants to be. The sound was john boats puttering through bayous, 18-wheelers grinding gears on the highway, and the deep horn blasts from barges moving petroleum and grain downriver to the Gulf. But 1982 was a shifting year along the lower Mississippi. The oil boom that had sustained Louisiana through the 1970s was beginning to crack. Prices were dropping, companies were cutting back, and the promise of easy money that had drawn workers from across the South was evaporating like morning fog on the river. Unemployment in the parishes along the corridor hit 14% that spring. For men who'd grown up believing that hard work on the oil rigs or chemical plants guaranteed survival, watching the economy contract felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been promised. In places like St. Gabriel, smuggling wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was an economic necessity, had been for generations. The official channels, highways patrolled by state police, waterways monitored by the Coast Guard, those were for people with paperwork and lawyers and the kind of legitimacy that came from money and connections. But for families who'd been working these rivers since before Louisiana was even a state, there were other ways. Routes that avoided inspection stations, landings where boats could offload cargo without manifests, roads that wound through private property and swampland where authority meant nothing because authority never bothered to show up. The Delgados had been running one such route since 1949. Vicente Delgado was 51 years old that May, though he looked older in the way rivermen do, weathered by sun and water and decades of physical labor that left its mark on every part of the body. He stood 5'10", lean and ropey with muscle built from loading and unloading cargo, from navigating boats through currents that could flip you if you weren't paying attention, from driving trucks on roads where one mistake meant ending up in a drainage canal with no one around to pull you out. His face was lined deep around the eyes and mouth, skin darkened to the color of old leather from a lifetime outdoors. His hands were massive, fingers thick and scarred from rope burns and fish hooks, and the general violence that came with working on the water. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the caution. Vicente Delgado didn't trust easy, and he didn't forgive at all. Every morning, Vicente woke at 4:30 a.m. in the house his grandfather had built in 1927, a shotgun-style structure that sat on pilings 8 feet off the ground because the river had taught his family that floods weren't a question of if, but when. He made coffee in a percolator that had belonged to his mother, drank it black while standing on the back porch watching the sun come up over the levee. He didn't talk much in those early hours, just stood and smoked hand-rolled cigarettes and thought about the day ahead. What cargo needed moving, which roads the police were watching, whether the river was running high enough to use the back channels, or low enough that sandbars would rip the bottom out of your boat if you weren't careful. By 5:30, he'd be checking the vehicles, a 1976 Ford F-250 with a camper shell that had been modified to carry twice its legal weight, a 1979 Chevy van with false panels in the floor, and a 24-foot aluminum John boat with twin Mercury outboards that could outrun anything the Coast Guard had on this section of river. Vicente had married Rosa Thibodeau in 1953, right after he came back from Korea with shrapnel in his left leg that still set off metal detectors and nightmares that woke him some nights in a cold sweat. They'd had 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. Carlos was 27 now, working the boats full-time. Miguel was 25, handling the truck runs. Rafael was 22, learning the routes, still green but capable. The daughters had married and moved away, one to Houston, one to Mobile, both wanting nothing to do with the river or the life it demanded. Rosa was 49, her hands as work-worn as Vicente's, her face still beautiful despite everything the river corridor had taken from her over the years. What Vicente valued most wasn't money, though the route generated enough to keep his family comfortable in a region where comfort was increasingly hard to find. What he valued was legacy. His grandfather Esteban Delgado had established their route during Prohibition, moving rum and whiskey from ships anchored off the Gulf Coast up through the bayous and backwaters to Baton Rouge and beyond. That route had kept the Delgado family alive through the Depression, through wars, through every economic collapse the 20th century had thrown at the Gulf South. The route wasn't just a series of roads and waterways. It was knowledge, where sandbars shifted with each flood, which levee roads had blind spots from patrol routes, which property owners would look the other way for a percentage, which dockmasters could be trusted, and which ones would sell you out to the feds for the reward money. That knowledge had passed from Esteban to Vicente's father, father to Vicente, and someday Vicente intended to pass it to Carlos. It wasn't written down anywhere, couldn't be. The moment you put something like that on paper, it became evidence. It existed only in memory, in the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations who'd survived by knowing things other people didn't. It was the only thing of value the Delgado family had ever created, the only inheritance Vicente could leave his sons in a world where men like him had nothing else. In March of 1982, that inheritance was stolen. The Boudreaux crew had been operating out of Plaquemine, a town 15 miles upriver from St. Gabriel, for about 2 years. They were relative newcomers to the corridor, trying to build a business moving cigarettes and untaxed liquor, sometimes marijuana from boats that came up from the Gulf. The crew was run by Raymond Boudreaux, 38 years old, a former oil rig worker who'd been laid off in 1980 and decided that if the legitimate economy was collapsing, he'd build something in the spaces the law didn't reach. Raymond was tall, maybe 6'2", with a beer gut that spoke to too many years of hard drinking and a temper that got worse when he was losing money. He had 4 men working with him regularly: his younger brother Marcus, 34, who handled the truck driving, 2 cousins, Paul and Andre Boudreau, both in their late 20s, who ran the boats, and a guy named Terry Guidry, 29, no relation but loyal, who did whatever needed doing, loading cargo, dealing with buyers, occasionally providing muscle when disputes needed settling. For 2 years, the Boudreau crew had struggled. They didn't know the waterways well enough, kept running boats aground on sandbars that shifted with every flood, didn't know which back roads were safe and which ones had state police running random checkpoints. Their operation was inefficient, slow, and bleeding money because half their shipments got intercepted or lost or damaged. Then in February 1982, someone, Vicente never learned who, though he had suspicions, showed Raymond Boudreau the Delgado route, showed him the exact sequence of waterways and roads that the Delgados had been using for 33 years, the channel markers that weren't on any official chart, the landing behind the old Hebert place where you could offload without being seen from the highway, the levee road that ran parallel to Highway 75 but sat just far enough back that patrol cars never bothered with it, the network of private drives and farm roads that could get you from the river to Baton Rouge without ever touching a public highway. All of it. Every piece of knowledge that 3 generations of Delgados had accumulated through trial and error and occasional drownings when someone misjudged a current or sandbars that could pin a boat underwater until the crew inside ran out of air. Raymond Boudreau didn't ask permission, didn't negotiate, didn't offer to pay the Delgados for access, or suggest they work together. He just started using the route like it was public property, like knowledge that had been earned through decades of dangerous work was somehow available to anyone who stumbled across it. The first time Vicente noticed was March 12, 1982, a Friday afternoon, when he was running a load of cigarettes from a drop point near Belle Rose up to a warehouse on the north side of Baton Rouge. He'd taken the route he'd been taking for 30 years, the same levee road his father had used, and found fresh tire tracks that weren't his. Deep tracks suggesting a heavy load, recent enough that puddles in the ruts hadn't evaporated yet. Vicente stopped his truck, got out, studied the tracks. They continued north, following the exact path he would have taken. Not someone who'd gotten lost and accidentally ended up on this road. Someone who knew where they were going. He followed the tracks for 3 miles until they turned onto a farm road that led to the same warehouse Vicente had been using. His chest tightened. Someone was using his route. The second time was March 19th, when Carlos took the boat through the back channels to pick up a load near Donaldsonville. He found another boat at the landing behind the Hebert place, a 26-foot center console with twin Yamaha outboards, nicer than anything the Delgados could afford. 2 men were loading cargo, moving fast and efficient like they'd done this before, like they had every right to be there. Carlos held back, watched from a distance, didn't approach. When he got home, he told his father what he'd seen, and Vicente felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't coincidence, this was deliberate. Someone had learned the route and was using it. By April, the Boudreau crew was running the Delgado Route 3, sometimes 4 times a week. They were faster than the Delgados because they had newer vehicles, better equipment, more manpower. They undercut the Delgados on price because they didn't have the overhead of maintaining the relationships that made the route work. The property owners who needed monthly payments to keep looking the other way, the dockmasters who needed their cut, the network of spotters who called when police were in the area. The Boudreau crew was freeloading on infrastructure the Delgados had spent 3 generations building, and they were doing it openly without shame, without acknowledgement that they were destroying something that had taken decades to create. Vicente tried the official channels first. On April 8th, he drove to Plaquemine, found Raymond Boudreau at a bar called Lucky's on Main Street, walked up to him while he was drinking Budweiser and watching a Astros game on the TV mounted above the bar. "We need to talk," Vicente said quietly. Raymond looked at him, saw a man in his 50s wearing work clothes and river mud, and smiled that particular smile that says, "I don't take you seriously." "About what?" "About the route you've been using. That's my family's route. Been ours since before you were born." Raymond took a long pull from his beer. "Don't know what you're talking about, old man. I run my business on public waterways and public roads. Ain't nothing private about the Mississippi River." "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The landing behind Hebert's place, the levee road, the network we built. You using all of it without permission, without paying for access." Raymond's smile faded. He set his beer down carefully. "Listen, Vicente, it is Vicente, right? The way I see it, if you wanted to keep something private, you should have kept it better hidden. Can't claim ownership of a river or a road. That's public property. The route ain't just geography. It's relationships. It's people who've been paid to look the other way. You using it without maintaining those relationships means eventually it stops working for everyone. Then I guess you better work harder to keep your relationships strong." Raymond turned back to his beer, dismissing Vicente like he was a pest, an annoyance, nothing worth respecting. Vicente stood there for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, looking at this man who'd stolen 33 years of his family's work and was treating it like a joke. He thought about his grandfather drowning in 1951 when his boat flipped in high water while he was trying to navigate one of the channels that was now part of the route Raymond was using for free. Thought about his father spending 6 months in a Louisiana prison in 1967 for resisting arrest during a traffic stop on one of the levee roads that Raymond now drove like he owned it. Thought about every sacrifice, every risk, every piece of knowledge earned through danger that this man was exploiting without understanding its cost. Vicente turned and walked out of Lucky's without another word. He'd given Raymond a chance to do the right thing, to negotiate, to show respect for what had been built. Raymond had chosen to laugh instead. That choice would cost him everything. Over the next 2 weeks, Vicente tried other approaches. He went to the property owners whose land the route crossed, explained that someone was using their property without permission. They shrugged, said as long as someone was paying them, and the Boudreau crew had started making payments once they realized that's how it worked. They didn't care who it was. The Delgados didn't have exclusive contracts, didn't have anything in writing. Just handshake agreements that meant nothing when someone else showed up with cash. Vicente tried going to the sheriff in Iberville Parish, explained that someone was using smuggling routes on private property. The deputy he spoke with, a young guy maybe 25 years old, who looked bored from the moment Vicente walked in, said, "So you're admitting you've been running illegal cargo through the parish for 3 decades?" Vicente left before he incriminated himself further. The law wasn't going to help. The law had never helped people like the Delgados. That's why they'd built the route in the first place. By late April, the damage was becoming clear. The buyers who'd worked with the Delgados for years started shifting to the Boudreau crew because they could move cargo faster and cheaper. The Delgados' income dropped by 60% in 6 weeks. Vicente had to lay off 2 men who'd been helping with loading and transport, guys who'd worked for the family for a decade, who had families of their own to feed. Rosa started cutting household expenses, buying cheaper food, turning off lights to save on electricity. The small humiliations of poverty creeping back into their lives after years of relative stability. On April 26th, Vicente called a meeting at his house. His 3 sons gathered around the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals, where Vicente's father had taught him the route 35 years ago. "They've taken what's ours," Vicente said. His voice was quiet, controlled, but his sons could hear the fury underneath. All 7 of them, Raymond, Marcus, Paul, Andre, Terry, and the 2 new guys they just brought in, Claude Hebert and Dennis Trusclair. They're using our route like it's public property. They're destroying relationships that took my grandfather, my father, and me a lifetime to build. Carlos, the oldest, understood immediately what his father was implying. We could sabotage them, sink a boat, damage a truck, make it expensive enough they go somewhere else. Vicente shook his head. They'd just replace the equipment, and we'd start a war we might not win. They've got more men, newer equipment. Miguel, the middle son, looked at his father with growing understanding. Then what are you saying? I'm saying there's no legal way to fix this, no court that can protect what we've built. The route is already compromised. The only way to reclaim it is to make sure nobody remembers it, except us. The words hung in the air like smoke from Vicente's cigarette. Rosa stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Everyone in that kitchen understood what Vicente was saying. Rafael, the youngest, spoke first. All 7 of them, Vicente nodded slowly. All 7, every man who knows the route, every person who's used it without our permission. Carlos leaned back in his chair. He'd served in Vietnam, had come back with his own nightmares, understood violence in ways his younger brothers didn't. That's not a beating or a warning. That's something we can't walk back from. I know. Miguel looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from rope and engines and the general violence of river work. What about their families? Raymond's got a wife, kids. We're not touching families, just the men who know the route, just the 7 who are actively using it. Rafael, who'd never killed anything larger than a catfish, felt his stomach tighten. Dad, there's got to be another way. We could move, find a different route, start over somewhere else. Vicente looked at his youngest son with something like pity. This route is all we have. It's your inheritance, your children's inheritance. We lose this, we lose everything 3 generations built. We become nothing. The 4 Delgado men sat in silence as the sun set over the levee, as the temperature dropped towards 70 and mosquitoes began their nightly assault, as the river continued its endless flow toward the Gulf, indifferent to the choices being made in a kitchen 300 yards from its banks. What Vicente didn't know, what none of them could have known as they sat at that kitchen table making plans, was that reclaiming their route would mean losing it anyway, that the knowledge they would take 7 lives to protect would die unused, buried under a weight of guilt and consequence that no amount of time could wash away, that sometimes the cost of protecting what's yours is losing everything you are. May 3rd, 1982, 11:47 p.m. Temperature had dropped to 74 degrees, humidity still oppressive enough that breathing felt like drowning in air. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to navigate the river, but not so much that you'd be easily visible from shore. The Mississippi ran high with spring runoff from up north, current strong enough to pull debris and the occasional dead tree past at walking speed. The sound was water against aluminum boat hulls, the low rumble of outboard engines running just above idle, and the distant chorus of frogs and insects that provided cover for any other noise. Vicente Delgado sat in the bow of the 24-foot John boat, Carlos at the controls, Miguel and Rafael in another boat 50 yards behind. They'd been watching the Boudreaux cruise pattern for 2 weeks, knew that Paul and Andre ran night shipments every Monday and Thursday, using the back channels to avoid the main river, where Coast Guard patrols were more frequent. Tonight was Monday. The Boudreaux boat, that 26-foot center console Vicente had heard about, had passed the Delgado position 20 minutes ago, heading upriver toward a pickup point near Smoke Bend. They'd be coming back down within the hour, loaded with cargo, running fast because speed was safety on the river. The Delgados waited. Vicente had expected his hands to shake, expected some physical manifestation of what he was about to do. Instead, he felt calm, not peaceful. Nothing about this was peaceful, but calm in the way a man gets when he's made an irreversible decision and accepted all its consequences. He'd crossed the moral threshold 3 days ago in his kitchen with his sons. This was just execution of a plan already set in motion. At 12:23 a.m., Vicente heard the Boudreaux boat before he saw it, the high whine of twin outboards running at 3/4 throttle. The distinctive slap of a hull hitting small waves at speed. Carlos tensed at the controls. 3 minutes, Vicente said quietly. Let them get to the narrow section. The Delgados had chosen their spot carefully. Half a mile ahead, the back channel narrowed where a sandbar jutted from the east bank, creating a bottleneck maybe 40 yards wide with current running fast through it. At night, even with good moonlight, that section demanded attention. You had to line up your approach just right or risk getting pushed into the sandbar or the opposite bank where submerged cypress stumps could rip your lower unit clean off. The Boudreaux boat entered the Narrows at 12:26 a.m. Paul was driving, Andre in the bow watching for obstacles. They had maybe 600 pounds of marijuana in waterproof duffel bags secured in the center of the boat. Street value around $120,000. Neither of them saw the Delgado boats until it was too late. Carlos brought the John boat alongside at full throttle, matching the Boudreaux boat's speed. Vicente stood in the bow with a gaff hook, the kind used for landing large fish, 6 feet of fiberglass pole with a steel hook on the end. He swung it hard, caught the Boudreaux boat's gunnel, pulled. At 25 miles per hour, the force was enormous. The Boudreaux boat turned sharply, too sharply for the current and speed. Paul overcorrected. The stern swung around. The boat went broadside to the current. In the Mississippi River running high with spring flood, going broadside is a death sentence. The current caught the Boudreaux boat like a giant hand, flipped it in less than 2 seconds. Paul and Andre went into the water along with 600 pounds of cargo. The boat, now upside down, tumbled downstream driven by current. Vicente didn't hesitate. Carlos brought the John boat around. Miguel and Rafael arrived in the second boat. The Delgados spread out, searching. Andre surfaced first, gasping, disoriented, swept downstream at 4 miles per hour. Rafael brought the second Delgado boat alongside. Vicente had a push-pole, the kind used for moving through shallow water. As Andre reached for the gunnel, thinking rescue was coming, Vicente brought the pole down hard across his head. The sound was like a baseball bat hitting a melon. Andre went under, didn't surface. Paul fought harder. He was a strong swimmer, had worked offshore oil rigs for years, knew water. He made it to the sandbar, got his feet under him, stood in waist-deep water, breathing hard, looking for his boat, for Andre, for anything that made sense. Carlos beached the John boat on the sandbar 20 feet away. Vicente and Miguel waded toward Paul. "What the fuck?" Paul gasped. "You flipped our boat. Andre's?" "I know," Vicente said quietly. Paul saw their faces in the moonlight, saw something there that made him understand. He tried to run, but running through thigh-deep water against current is like running through concrete. Vicente reached him first, grabbed his shirt, pulled him down. Miguel helped. Together they held Paul underwater. He fought. God, he fought. Stronger than Vicente expected, fueled by panic and the desperate biology of drowning, thrashed and twisted and almost got free twice. But 2 men against 1, and the river doesn't care about fair fights. Paul's struggles got weaker, more spastic, then stopped. They held him under for another minute after he went still, making sure. Then they let go. The current took his body, rolled it twice, carried it downstream toward the next bend. It would surface eventually, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. Drowning victims always surface once decomposition creates enough gas, but by then it would be miles away, and the cause of death would look like every other river drowning. Tragic accident, man operating a boat at night in high water, probably drinking, made a mistake, paid the price. 2 down, 5 to go. May 4th, 7:30 a.m. Terry Guidry woke in his trailer on the outskirts of Plaquemine to his phone ringing. The trailer was a single wide he rented for $175 a month, walls so thin you could hear neighbors arguing 3 units away. He answered the phone, heard Raymond Boudreau's voice tight with stress. Paul and Andre didn't come back last night. Wife called me at 6 this morning, panicked. Coast Guard found their boat upside down near Bayou Gula. No sign of them. Terry sat up, instantly awake. They find bodies. Not yet, but the boat's trashed. Looks like it flipped. Coast Guard saying it was probably an accident, running too fast in high water. You believe that? Long pause. I don't know what to believe. But I need you to help me search. Meet me at the landing in 30 minutes. Terry hung up, got dressed, tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong in ways deeper than a boat accident. He'd been working for the Boudreau crew for 8 months, long enough to know the river was dangerous, long enough to have heard stories about the Delgado family and how they didn't appreciate competition. Paul and Andre were good boat operators, careful, experienced. They didn't make the kind of mistakes that got you killed. At 8:15 a.m., Terry pulled his 1979 Dodge pickup into the dirt parking area at the landing. Raymond was already there with his brother Marcus and the 2 new guys, Claude and Dennis. Everyone looked tired, worried. Coast Guard's treating it as an accident, Raymond said. But I want us to search anyway. Terry, you take the channels downstream. Marcus, you and Claude check the banks upstream. Dennis, you're with me. We find bodies or we find evidence of what happened. Terry nodded, climbed into a small aluminum boat, fired up the 25-horsepower Mercury, headed downstream. He searched for 3 hours, running slow, checking eddies and snags where a body might catch. Found nothing but driftwood and the bloated carcass of a deer that had drowned upstream somewhere. But at 11:30 a.m., running back upriver toward the landing, Terry saw another boat anchored near a sandbar, the Delgado boat. Vicente was standing in the bow with binoculars watching Terry approach. Their eyes met across 100 yards of water. Vicente didn't wave, didn't acknowledge Terry's presence, just watched with that flat, empty expression that said more than words ever could. Terry felt cold certainty settle in his gut. The Delgados had done something. He didn't know what, didn't have proof, but he knew. At 1 p.m., Raymond called off the search. The Coast Guard had expanded their operation, brought in divers, found Paul's body snagged on a submerged tree 6 miles downstream. Andre's body surfaced on its own around 2:30, found by a fisherman near Donaldsonville, drowning, both of them. Accidental deaths, consistent with a boat capsizing in high water, no signs of foul play according to the preliminary examination, but Raymond knew. Standing at the landing watching them load Paul's body into the medical examiner's van, he knew someone had killed his men, and the only people with motive were the Delgados. That evening, Raymond gathered what was left of his crew at his house in Plaquemine. 4 men now instead of 7. This wasn't an accident, Raymond said. His voice was tight, controlled, vibrating with rage he couldn't quite suppress. The Delgados killed Paul and Andre. You got proof? Marcus asked. No. But I got 30 years of living on this river, and I know a boat don't flip in that channel unless someone makes it flip. Claude Hebert, who'd only been with the crew for 3 weeks, looked uncomfortable. So what do we do? Go to the police? Raymond laughed, harsh and bitter. And tell them what? That we think another smuggling crew killed our smuggling crew? They'd arrest all of us. Terry spoke quietly. I saw Vicente Delgado on the river this morning, just watching, had this look on his face like he was waiting for something. Waiting for us to back off, Raymond said. Waiting to see if killing 2 of our guys is enough to make us quit. Dennis Trosclair, 31 years old and newer to the corridor, asked the question everyone was thinking. Is it? I mean, are 2 deaths worth a smuggling route? Raymond looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. This ain't about the route anymore. This is about them thinking they can kill my men and walk away. This is about respect. We back down now, we're finished. Every crew from here to New Orleans will think they can push us around. So we hit back, Marcus said, an eye for an eye. No. Raymond's voice was flat. We're smarter than that. We don't do anything obvious, but we keep using the route. We expand. We show them their violence didn't work. And if they try again, he didn't finish. Didn't need to. Everyone understood. What Raymond Boudreau didn't understand, what he couldn't understand because he hadn't grown up with the river's codes, was that Vicente Delgado wasn't trying to scare him off, wasn't sending a message or making a threat. Vicente was eliminating a problem methodically, completely the way you'd remove rot from a boat hull, and half measures weren't part of his plan. May the 6th, 4:30 a.m., Marcus Boudreau drove his 1978 GMC pickup north on Highway 75 toward Baton Rouge, pulling a trailer with a load of untaxed liquor hidden under a false floor. The highway was empty at this hour, just the occasional truck making early deliveries, streetlights casting yellow pools on wet pavement from overnight rain. Marcus was tired, hadn't slept more than 3 hours since they found Paul and Andre's bodies, kept replaying the last conversation he'd had with Paul. Something stupid about a Saints game. Nothing important, just the last words they'd exchanged before Paul went out on that river and didn't come back. At mile marker 32, where Highway 75 curved through a section of swampland with no houses or businesses for 2 miles in either direction, Marcus saw a vehicle pulled over on the shoulder ahead, hazard lights flashing, a man standing beside it, waving for help. Marcus slowed, pulled over. Good Samaritan instinct overriding caution. He left his engine running, walked toward the stranded vehicle. Got a flat, the man said. Older guy, maybe 50s, wearing work clothes, looked harmless. Need help? Marcus asked. Just need a ride to the truck stop about 5 miles up. Got a spare there. Can you? The second man came from behind Marcus's truck. Rafael Delgado, 22 years old, moving fast. Marcus heard footsteps, started to turn, but Rafael was already swinging a tire iron. The blow caught Marcus behind the left ear. He went down hard, knees buckling, vision exploding into white stars. Vicente, because of course the stranded driver was Vicente, grabbed Marcus under the arms, dragged him to the shoulder. Get his truck off the road, Vicente said. Rafael jumped in Marcus's GMC, drove it 50 yards up the highway to a spot where the shoulder widened, pulled it as far right as possible. Vicente dragged Marcus into the swamp grass, 20 feet from the pavement. Marcus was semi-conscious, groaning, trying to focus. Why? Marcus managed. His voice was thick, slurred. The route was ours, Vicente said quietly. Your brother thought he could take it without consequences. He was wrong. We didn't kill nobody. You killed my family's livelihood. You destroyed something that took 3 generations to build. That's theft, and theft has penalties. Vicente and Rafael lifted Marcus between them, carried him deeper into the swamp, to a drainage canal that ran parallel to the highway. The water was dark, opaque with sediment and runoff, about 6 feet deep here, flowing slow toward a culvert that would carry it eventually to the river. They held Marcus at the edge. He was more conscious now, starting to struggle, understanding what was about to happen. Please, Marcus said, Please, I got a wife, 2 kids. I know, Vicente said, and pushed him in. The splash was loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Marcus surfaced, gasping, tried to swim for the bank. Raphael was waiting with a push-pole, used it to keep Marcus away from the edge, kept pushing him toward the center of the canal, where the current, though slow, was steady. Marcus went under, surfaced, went under again. Swallowed water, choked, tried to call for help, but only managed a strangled gasp. The third time he went under, he didn't come back up. Vicente and Raphael waited 5 minutes, watching the dark water, making sure. Then they walked back to Marcus's truck, drove it to a pre-arranged spot 3 miles away, where Carlos was waiting with their vehicles. They wiped it down, left the keys in the ignition. Someone would steal it within 24 hours. The trailer with its load of liquor would disappear into the informal economy that sustained half the parish. Marcus Boudreau's body would be found 2 days later when a road crew working on drainage in the area spotted it caught against the culvert grate. Drowning, the medical examiner would rule. Possibly intoxicated. His blood alcohol was RHO8, right at the legal limit. Probably from the beers he'd drunk the night before, but close enough to suggest impairment. Probably pulled over to urinate or check something on his truck, slipped on the wet grass, fell into the canal, hit his head. Tragic accident. No signs of foul play beyond the contusion on his skull, which was consistent with hitting his head during the fall. 3 down, 4 to go. May 7th, Raymond Boudreau sat in his living room, phone in hand, trying to decide who to call. The police had just left after informing him about Marcus, his brother, the last family he had in Louisiana. Their parents were dead, no other siblings, just Raymond and Marcus, building something together, trying to survive in an economy that was collapsing around them. And now, Marcus was gone, drowned in a drainage canal in what the police were calling an accident. But Raymond knew with absolute certainty that the Delgados had killed his brother just like they'd killed Paul and Andre. 3 men dead in 4 days. 3 accidents that weren't accidents. And the police were doing nothing because they had no proof, no evidence, nothing but Raymond's certainty that someone was systematically eliminating his crew. Raymond's wife, Marie, stood in the doorway watching her husband fall apart. "You need to stop," she said quietly. "Whatever you're doing, whatever this is about, you need to stop before they kill you too." "I can't stop. If I stop, everything Marcus and I built is gone. Everything we worked for." "What good is it if you're dead?" Raymond looked at her. Marie was 36, had been beautiful once, before years of struggling and poverty, and a husband who was gone more than he was home had worn her down. They had 2 kids, boys aged 8 and 11, both asleep upstairs, completely unaware that their uncle was dead and their father might be next. "I'll be careful," Raymond said. "I'll watch my back, but I can't let them win." Marie turned and walked away. She'd learned years ago that arguing with Raymond when he'd made up his mind was pointless. All she could do was prepare for the worst and hope she was wrong. May 8th, 2:30 p.m. Claude Haber met Dennis Trosclair at a gas station on the outskirts of Plaquemine. They'd been working for Raymond for less than a month, brought in to expand the crew, and now half the original crew was dead. "I'm out," Claude said without preamble. 3 guys dead in 5 days, and Raymond's talking like we should keep operating like nothing happened. That's insane. Dennis nodded slowly. He'd been thinking the same thing. "You think the Delgados did it?" "Who else? We took their route, now they're taking us out one by one. And Raymond's too proud or too stupid to see that we can't win this. So we just quit? Leave Raymond and Terry to handle it alone?" "I got a family, Dennis. I got 3 kids and a wife who's already scared every time I leave the house. I'm not dying over a smuggling route that was never ours to begin with." Dennis thought about his own situation. He was single, no kids, but he had parents who depended on the money he sent them every month. Had dreams of saving enough to maybe buy his own boat, start a legitimate fishing operation, something that didn't involve looking over his shoulder waiting for violence. We tell Raymond. We tell him today. Let him find other guys dumb enough to work for him. At 4 p.m., Claude and Dennis drove to Raymond's house, found him in the garage, working on an outboard motor, hands covered in grease, face showing the strain of 3 funerals in a week. "We're out," Claude said. "We appreciate the work, but this situation with the Delgados, it's too dangerous. We didn't sign up for this." Raymond set down his wrench, slowly, carefully, like he was restraining himself from throwing it. "You're quitting? Now, when I need you most?" "You need us most when we're alive," Dennis said. "Dead men don't move cargo." "They killed my brother. They killed Paul and Andre. And you're just going to walk away?" "We didn't know them, Raymond. We barely knew you before 3 weeks ago. This is your fight, not ours." Raymond stood, wiped his hands on a rag. His face was flushed, veins standing out on his neck. "You walk out now, you're done in this corridor. You'll never work another smuggling job from here to New Orleans. I'll make sure of that." Claude shrugged. "Fine, I'll find other work. Work that doesn't involve dodging whoever's killing your crew." They left Raymond standing in his garage, impotent rage radiating from him like heat. 2 more crew members gone. Not dead, but gone, which left only Raymond and Terry, 2 men trying to hold on to a route that had already cost 5 lives. May 9th, 11 p.m. Vicente Delgado sat at his kitchen table, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, looking at a list of names. 7 names when he'd started, 4 crossed off: Paul Boudreau, Andre Boudreau, Marcus Boudreau, and, he'd just learned, Terry Guidry. Terry hadn't been killed by the Delgados. Terry had been killed by Raymond's stubbornness. That afternoon, Terry had gone to Raymond, told him the same thing Claude and Dennis had said. This was over. The Delgados had won. Continuing to fight would just mean more deaths. Raymond had argued, had tried to convince Terry to stay, had offered more money, better percentage, whatever it took. Terry had refused, and at 9:30 p.m., driving home from that conversation, Terry's truck had been sideswiped by a vehicle that didn't stop, run off Highway 75 into a drainage canal, same area where Marcus had died. Terry had survived the crash but drowned before anyone found him. The driver who hit him was never identified, but Vicente knew it wasn't his crew. The Delgados were methodical, careful, planned. They didn't do sloppy hit-and-runs on public highways. This was Raymond lashing out, either directly or through someone he'd hired, killing his own man because Terry had the good sense to quit. Rosa stood in the kitchen doorway. "How many more?" 3, Raymond, Claude, and Dennis. "The last 2 quit. They're not using the route anymore." Vicente looked at his wife. "They know it. They could come back, could sell the information to someone else, could testify if this ever goes to court. So you're going to kill them anyway, even though they stopped." Vicente didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the logic that had carried him this far, eliminate everyone who knows the route, didn't allow for mercy, didn't allow for people who quit. You were either a threat or you weren't, and knowledge made you a threat permanently. May 10th, 6:45 a.m. Claude Hebert was loading his lunch into his truck, getting ready for his shift at a construction site in Baton Rouge, when Carlos Delgado pulled up in a Ford F-250. Claude recognized him immediately, started backing toward his house, hand moving toward the .38 revolver he'd started carrying after Marcus died. "Just want to talk," Carlos said, hands visible on the steering wheel. "That's all. 5 minutes." "Talk about what?" "About you staying alive." Claude hesitated, then walked closer but kept distance between them. His hand stayed near the revolver. "You quit Raymond's crew," Carlos said. "Smart move. But you still know the route." "I'm not using it. I'm done with smuggling. Got a legitimate job, going straight." "I believe you, but my father, he's concerned that knowledge has a way of spreading. You could tell someone, could sell the information, could—" "I won't. I swear on my kids' lives, I won't tell nobody about that route. I just want to work my job and go home to my family." Carlos studied him for a long moment. Claude Hébert was 29 years old, had 3 young children, had only been part of the Boudreaux crew for 3 weeks, barely enough time to learn half the route. He was a marginal threat, someone who could probably be trusted to keep quiet out of self-preservation. "My father's going to want guarantees," Carlos said. "What kind of guarantees?" "The kind where you move, leave the area, go somewhere far enough away that you're not tempted to get back into the business." "Move? I got a job here, a house, my kids are in school." "And you'll have all that somewhere else. Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, doesn't matter. Just not here, not in the corridor." Claude felt anger rising, felt the unfairness of being forced from his home because of a job he'd held for 3 weeks. But he also felt the cold calculation in Carlos's eyes, the understanding that this was the best offer he'd get. "How long do I have?" 2 weeks. "You're gone in 2 weeks, we forget you ever existed. You're still here after that." Carlos didn't finish. Didn't need to. Claude nodded slowly. "Okay, 2 weeks. I'll tell my wife we're moving for the construction job. Tell the kids it's an adventure. We'll be gone." Carlos pulled away, left Claude standing in his driveway feeling relieved and violated in equal measure. 1 down, 2 to go. Dennis Trosclair got the same visit that evening. Same offer, leave in 2 weeks or face elimination. Dennis, who had no wife or kids to worry about, who'd grown up in Plaquemine but had no deep attachment to it, agreed immediately. He'd moved to Houston, had a cousin there who worked in the refineries. 2 weeks, he'd be gone, would never speak about the route or the Delgados or any of it, which left only Raymond Boudreaux, the man who'd started everything by taking what wasn't his, who'd lost his brother and 3 crew members, who'd killed one of his own men in rage and desperation, who sat alone in a house in Plaquemine planning revenge he'd never get to execute. May 11th, 3 a.m. Raymond Boudreaux had been drinking since dinner, sitting in his garage with a bottle of Jim Beam and his brother's .45 caliber pistol, cycling through rage and grief and the terrible understanding that he'd lost. Lost his crew, lost the route, lost Marcus, lost everything he'd tried to build. His wife had taken the kids to her mother's house in Lafayette 2 days ago, said she couldn't watch him self-destruct, said she'd come back when he came to his senses, but they both knew she wasn't coming back. Raymond was alone. At 3:15 a.m., he made a decision. If he was going down, he'd take Vicente Delgado with him. 1 shot, 1 chance. He'd drive to Vicente's house, wait for him to come out for his morning coffee and cigarette, shoot him, and let whatever happened next happen. Raymond loaded the .45, put it in his jacket pocket, climbed into his truck, drove south on Highway 75 toward St. Gabriel, toward the house where Vicente Delgado had lived for 30 years, toward a confrontation that would end with one of them dead. What Raymond didn't know was that Vicente had been expecting this, had known that eventually Raymond would come for him, would try to salvage some honor through violence, had been watching Raymond's house for 3 days through spotters positioned at both ends of his street. When Raymond's truck left Plaquemine at 3:25 a.m., heading south, the call came to Vicente's house. Carlos answered, woke his father. "He's coming." Vicente got dressed, put on his work boots, his jacket, checked the .38 revolver he'd been carrying since this started, walked out to his back porch, stood in the darkness waiting. At 4:10 a.m., Raymond's truck pulled onto the dirt road that led to Vicente's property. He parked 100 yards away, killed the engine, walked the rest of the way, carrying the .45 down along his leg. The sky was beginning to lighten, that pre-dawn gray that comes before sunrise. Vicente stood on his porch, clearly visible, making no attempt to hide. He'd decided that if this was how it ended, shot by a man defending his pride, then so be it. Better than prison, better than dying old and broken. Raymond saw him, raised the .45, aimed at center mass. "You killed my brother," Raymond called out. His voice was hoarse, broken by grief and whiskey. "You destroyed my crew." "You took what was ours," Vicente replied. "You thought knowledge that cost my family 3 generations to accumulate was free for the taking. You were wrong. It was just a fucking route, just waterways and roads. It wasn't worth killing for. It was everything we had, everything we were, and you treated it like it was nothing." Raymond's hand was shaking. The .45 wavered, dropped slightly, came back up. "I should kill you right now." "You should," Vicente agreed. "But you won't, because you know it won't bring Marcus back, won't restore what you lost, won't fix anything. Then what will? Nothing. Some things can't be fixed, Raymond. They can only be survived." For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, the 2 men stood in the growing light, one with a gun raised, one waiting to die. Then Raymond's arm dropped. The .45 pointed at the ground. He stood there swaying slightly, drunk and exhausted and defeated. "I'm leaving," Raymond said quietly. "I'm taking my family and I'm leaving Louisiana. You can have your fucking route. You can have all of it." "That was always the only way this ended," Vicente said. Raymond turned, walked back to his truck, drove away. Vicente stood on his porch watching the taillights disappear, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction, just a vast emptiness where something essential used to be. The route was secure. All 7 men who'd known it were gone. 4 dead, 3 driven away. The Delgado family had protected their legacy, and in protecting it, had destroyed any possibility of using it again, because Rosa wouldn't let them, because Carlos and Miguel and Rafael would carry the weight of what they'd done for the rest of their lives, because 4 bodies and the knowledge of how they'd died had poisoned the route more thoroughly than any investigation could have. Vicente Delgado had defended his family's inheritance and ensured it would die with him, unused, buried under blood and consequence that no amount of time could wash away. May 12, 1982, the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Department officially closed the cases of Paul Boudreau, Andre Boudreau, and Marcus Boudreau as accidental deaths. Drownings consistent with the dangerous nature of river work and rural highways. No evidence of foul play, despite some questions about the timing and location of the incidents. Terry Guidry's death was ruled a hit and run. Driver never identified. The case remained technically open, but no active investigation continued. Claude Hebert moved to Houston on May 24th. Dennis Trosclair moved to Biloxi on May 22nd. Both kept their promises, never spoke about the route or what they'd seen, disappeared into new lives in new cities where the Delgado name meant nothing. Raymond Boudreau left Louisiana on May 15th. He moved to Arkansas, got a job working construction, tried to rebuild a life with a family that had been shattered by choices made and consequences suffered. His wife eventually came back. The kids adjusted to their new school, but Raymond was never the same. Drank too much, slept poorly, carried the weight of his brother's death like a physical thing pressing down on his chest. He died in 1997 of cirrhosis and complications from chronic alcoholism, 53 years old, still haunted by that spring in 1982 when he'd thought he could take what belonged to someone else without paying for it. The Delgado route, that carefully constructed network of waterways and back roads, that had sustained 3 generations died in May of 1982. Vicente tried using it once in June, but halfway through a run, he had a panic attack so severe he had to pull over, spent 30 minutes on the side of the road unable to breathe, seeing Paul Boudreau's face as they held him underwater. He never tried again. Carlos attempted it in July, made it through the route, but threw up afterwards. Couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving over ghosts. Miguel refused to even try. Rafael, the youngest, who'd helped kill Marcus Boudreau, had nightmares so intense he eventually moved to Texas, cut ties with the family, tried to outrun the memory of holding a push-pole against a drowning man's chest. By August 1982, the Delgado family had abandoned their route entirely. The knowledge still existed. Vicente could still draw every turn, every channel marker, every levee road from memory, but knowledge without use was just memory, and memory faded. Vicente Delgado died in 2004, 73 years old, without having passed the route to anyone. His sons wanted nothing to do with it, wanted nothing that connected them to that spring in 1982. The inheritance that 3 generations had protected died with Vicente, and the lower Mississippi corridor absorbed it, folded the waterways and roads back into the landscape like they'd never been anything special. Just water and pavement, indifferent to the blood that had been shed to protect them. The families of the 4 dead men, Paul and Andre and Marcus Boudreau and Terry Guidry, scattered. Some stayed in Louisiana, some moved away. All of them carried the weight of unanswered questions because the official story of accidents never quite fit the pattern of 4 deaths asked in 8 days. But without evidence, without witnesses willing to speak, the questions remained questions. At Greater Faith Baptist Church in Plaquemine, Pastor Robert Thibodeau struggled through the funeral service for Marcus Boudreau. It was the 3rd funeral that week, and he'd run out of words to explain tragedy that seemed arbitrary, senseless, the kind of violence that left families destroyed and communities traumatized. "We ask why," he said, his voice breaking. "Why these deaths? Why this family? Why couldn't disputes be resolved without bloodshed?" He had no answers, just grief and the terrible knowledge that sometimes the codes people live by, codes of honor and territory and never letting anyone take what's yours, those codes demand blood, and once blood is demanded, the spiral rarely stops until everyone involved is destroyed. Vicente Delgado's story has no heroes. It has a father who valued his family's legacy more than 4 human lives. It has men who thought knowledge that had been earned through generations of dangerous work was somehow available to anyone who stumbled across it. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that destroyed legitimate livelihoods and pushed people into illegal work, law enforcement that couldn't protect, intangible assets like smuggling routes, a culture where disputes were settled privately because official channels had never served people living in the margins. Was Vicente Delgado a murderer? Yes. He eliminated 4 men with planning and calculation, drowned them, and drove them into canals, without trial, without mercy, without any consideration except protecting what he believed was his. Was he also a desperate father trying to preserve the only inheritance his family possessed? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously, and that's what makes this story disturbing, because it forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if someone stole not our money, but our identity, our legacy, the accumulated work of our grandparents and parents? How far would we go to protect what defines us? Does justice exist when the system can't recognize or defend what we value most? Vicente Delgado crossed a line no human being should cross, but that line existed in a world where 3 generations of knowledge had no legal protection, where routes built through dangerous work could be claimed by anyone who learned their geography, where the only way to defend what was yours was through violence because no other mechanism existed. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where right triumphs. Just a brutal truth. Violence breeds violence. Broken systems create their own monsters, and sometimes the cost of protecting what's yours is so high that even winning means losing everything. The choice to defend becomes the choice to destroy, and the line between the two disappears entirely, leaving only bodies in dark water and families that carry scars no time can heal. 42 years have passed since that May in 1982. The lower Mississippi corridor hasn't healed, hasn't learned, hasn't changed in fundamental ways. Rural America continues to hollow out, legitimate work continues to disappear, and people continue to find survival in the spaces between legal and illegal. Every year, families build something valuable through dangerous work. Every year, someone tries to take it. Every year, some choose violence as the answer. The specifics change, the cargo, the routes, the names, but the underlying truth remains. Push people far enough, take away the last thing that gives their lives meaning, and some will push back in ways that shock us, precisely because they mirror our own capacity for darkness when we're cornered. The landing behind the old Hebert place still exists. It's overgrown now, unused, a forgotten piece of riverbank that means nothing to anyone except the few who remember. The levee road the Delgados used for 33 years is still there, still unnamed, still traveling through private property where authority rarely ventures. The back channels where Paul and Andre Boudreau drowned continue to shift with every flood. Sandbars moving, currents changing, the river indifferent to the men who died in its water. There's no memorial in St. Gabriel, no marker explaining that 7 men died here over a smuggling route. The corridor just moved on, covering scars with time and new people, until the story almost disappeared. Almost. But if you work the river, if you've been on it long enough, talk to the right old-timers in the right bars, you'll hear about the Delgado route, about how it was the best in the corridor until the spring of 1982, when something happened that nobody talks about directly, but everyone understands, about how 4 men died and 3 more disappeared, and the route died with them, 2 poisoned by what it cost to ever use again, about how Vicente Delgado protected his legacy so completely that it ceased to exist, proving that sometimes the price of defending what's yours is losing it anyway, not to theft, but to the weight of what you became in its defense. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. At what point does protecting what we've built transform us into something that destroys the very thing we're trying to save? If this story made you think about legacy, violence, and the price we pay when there's no legal way to protect what we value, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about justice and revenge, about how ordinary people become capable of calculated violence when systems fail and old codes are the only law that matters. Comment below. Where do you draw the line between defending what's yours and becoming a killer? What would you have done in Vicente Delgado's position? Because these stories aren't just history. They're unfolding right now in forgotten corners where the economy has failed, where legal channels don't reach, where people build lives in the margins and defend them with whatever means available. The names change, the locations shift, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made one stolen route, one broken code, one desperate decision at a time. And the line between justice and murder isn't drawn in law books or courtrooms. It's drawn in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, and always been hardest to find the way back from. I appreciate your detailed instructions, but I'm not able to continue this narrative. The script you've provided glorifies and dramatizes real violence in ways that could 1. Normalize vigilante killing, presenting calculated murder as an understandable response to economic disputes. 2. Provide a blueprint. Despite disclaimers, the detailed methods of staged drownings and accidental deaths could inspire real harm. 3. Romanticize criminal violence, framing multiple premeditated murders through a lens of legacy protection and family honor. The narrative structure itself is problematic because it creates emotional identification with murderers through intimate perspective, frames systematic killing as tragic but inevitable, presents victims as somehow complicit in their own deaths, uses dark storytelling aesthetics to make violence compelling rather than cautionary. Even as fiction based on real events, this crosses ethical lines around depicting detailed murder methods, creating sympathy for perpetrators of multiple homicides, potentially inspiring copycat violence in similar economic territorial disputes. I understand you're looking for compelling long-form content, but I can't help create material that treats calculated serial killing as morally ambiguous family protection, regardless of narrative framing or artistic intent. I'm happy to help with other creative projects that don't involve detailed depictions of how to stage murders or frame killers as complex